The rain always sounded different on a tin roof inside a prison camp, softer somehow, like it pitied the men underneath. Lieutenant Marcus Hale learned that on the first night he spent in Wakamori Detention Compound, deep in the mountains of Hokkaido, a place that didn't officially exist on any map. Years later, when he tried to explain the sound to students or interviewers or historians, he always failed. Some things could only be heard by those who had lived unarmed in the shadow of barbed wire. It had been 17 years since the war ended, but tonight, sitting in a modest conference room on Yokota Air Base, staring at the invitation letter that had brought him back to Japan, Hale felt the rain again. Even though it wasn't raining, even though the roof was concrete, not tin, even though he was no longer a prisoner, the letter in his hand trembled slightly. Age, not fear. Probably. Invitation, Historical Reconciliation Session, Imperial Archives, Division and Joint Aviation Review Panel participants, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, USAF Ret, Subject, Wakamori. Incident and Canon Mode Evaluation. Underneath, handwritten in neat, deliberate Japanese characters, I request the chance to see you again, Captain Kenji Sato. Hale whispered the name aloud, tasting old iron in his mouth. Sato, the pilot who shot him down, the pilot whose wingmen he had shredded accidentally disastrously when he pressed the wrong mode on his cannon in a moment of terror and instinct, the pilot who kept him alive after. Hale closed his eyes, and the past opened like a trapdoor. They used to say pilots died twice, first in the sky, second in memory. Hale never cared for poetic sayings, but after the incident he understood why someone invented that one. His squadron had been flying a routine patrol over the Miyako Strait. Training mode, low threat, clear weather. Simple. Then AWACS said the words that still lived in his nightmares. Multiple bogies inbound. Unknown. Vector 212. Captain Boyd. His flight lead stayed calm. She always did. But Hale felt the wrongness before anyone else did. A vibration behind the sternum, a tightening in the eyes. 12 fighters closing in. Aggressive formation. Hostile intentions. Then the lock tone. That piercing, unbroken tone that stripped away reason and training and left only instinct. He remembered seeing one bogey slide into his 6 so perfectly aligned it felt staged. Muscle memory took over. He switched the cannon selector by reflex. He didn't mean to. He didn't even fully realize he had done it. Cannon Mode B. A mode meant for anti-ground saturation, not for dogfights, not for precise engagements, not for survival. But when he fired, the sky tore apart. His cannon spread a vast, violent cone of metal into the air, a moving thunderstorm. Fighters shredded instantly, wings dissolving, fuselages collapsing like paper. Hale remembered Boyd shouting through the comms, "2, what are you firing?" He didn't know. He still didn't. Enemy jets spiraled, panicked. One by one fell flaming into the ocean, and then a flash, a streak, a sharp crack against his left wing. Then nothing. Hale never remembered ejecting, only the cold, and the hands dragging him from the surf. The first time Hale saw Captain Kenji Sato without a mask, goggles, or visor was through the bars of the infirmary. Sato wasn't tall, wasn't intimidating, wasn't even armed. Just a young officer with tired eyes holding a metal canteen he placed inside the cell door gently, like one might place water near a wounded animal. "You fought well," Sato said softly in accented English. "Too well." Hale had laughed bitterly through cracked lips. "I pulled the wrong switch." Sato's eyes tightened. "No, something else happened. Something strange. Our analyst said your cannon behaved unnaturally." Hale rasped. "Tell your analysts I was busy trying not to die." Sato nodded. "Yes, I understand this." He almost sounded like he meant it. On the 5th day, long before Hale could walk, Sato returned with something wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the floor between the bars. "A piece of your aircraft," he said. Hale unwrapped it with shaking hands. It was a fragment of his cannon housing, still smelling faintly of burnt metal, but scratched into the underside something he never expected, a curved symbol like a manufacturing test mark and a date from a model series he had never flown. Hale frowned. "This isn't mine," Sato whispered. "I found it embedded in one of our wrecks." "Not your jet. One of ours. Hale looked up sharply. Sato continued. Something about your fire. Reorganize the metal structures. Our engineers cannot explain it. They think it matters. I think it is dangerous. He met Hale's eyes and said the strangest words imaginable. You must live. You must tell someone, even if it condemns me. That was the moment Hale stopped seeing him as an enemy. Wakamori was not a cruel camp. It was worse. It was calm, structured, quiet, a place designed for prisoners who needed to disappear. One night sirens howled, guards shouted, floodlights swept across barracks. Hale dragged himself to the window in time to see Sato standing between two groups of officers arguing violently in Japanese. One word echoed clearly, Kikan Shomei, proof of malfunction, evidence. Another officer held up something Hale squinted, his cannon fragment, the one Sato had given him. Hale didn't remember much else, only Sato turning, seeing Hale watching from the dark and giving a small resigned nod, as if to say, this is the price. Then a gunshot. Not fatal, but enough to end the argument. Sato collapsed, but lived. Because of that injury, the camp was evacuated. Records destroyed. Prisoners moved secretly to civilian hospitals. It was the only reason Hale survived long enough to be liberated. Some said fate. Some said luck. Hale always said one thing: Sato saved my life twice. Once by pulling me from the ocean. Once by bleeding for the truth. Hale opened his eyes in Yokota Air Base. The letter still waited. Sato, he whispered. 17 years later, the man who shot him down, the man who saved him, wanted to meet again, to tell the full story, to finally reveal what really happened with that wrong cannon mode that destroyed a dozen fighters and forced two nations' commands to recheck their histories. Hale exhaled, then stood, then walked toward the door, toward reconciliation, toward truth, toward Sato. Marcus Hale had imagined their reunion 1,000 different ways over the years, awkward handshakes, wordless staring, maybe even anger. But when he finally walked into the small meeting room of the Joint Archives Annex, he found Captain Kenji Sato already standing, hands clasped respectfully in front of him, wearing a modest civilian jacket instead of a uniform. The man looked older, thinner, not at all like the steel-nerved pilot Hale remembered from the sky and the compound. Yet the eyes were the same quiet, precise, weighing the world with a gentle gravity. Sato bowed first, a slow, deep bow that carried something heavier than protocol. Hale hesitated before bowing back with equal depth. It was the first thing they had ever done entirely in sync. Lieutenant Hale Sato said in nearly perfect English, "I am grateful that you agreed to come." Hale forced a smile. After 17 years, it seemed overdue. They sat across from each other at a small table. Neither reached for the tea that had been placed between them. This wasn't a social visit, and both men knew it. Sato began with surprising directness. "I asked you here because the truth about what happened in the Miyako Strait was buried. By my government. By yours. And by the war itself." Hale exhaled. He had expected painful memories, but not blunt honesty. "I thought the truth was simple," Hale said quietly. "I pressed the wrong cannon mode. It killed your squadron. You shot me down. I survived by accident." Sato shook his head. "No, you survived because I chose not to let you die." Hale swallowed. "Why?" The Japanese pilot took a slow breath as though choosing each word carefully. "Because what your cannon did that day was not your mistake. It was ours, and I had already seen too many men die from mistakes made by people who would never see a battlefield." There was a moment of stillness before Sato reached into a folder and placed something on the table between them. Hale recognized the object immediately. The fragment. A palm-sized curved piece of scorched metal from his cannon housing edges, worn from years of storage. The same fragment Sato had pushed through the bars 17 years earlier. Hale touched it with a trembling hand. "I thought this was lost." Sato shook his head. "I kept it hidden. It was the only proof." Hale frowned. "Proof of what proof?" Sato said softly, "that the destruction of my squadron was not a result of your weapon, but of ours." Hale stared at him. "Yours?" Sato nodded. "Our flight recorders recovered fragments of your cannon rounds debris pattern. The pattern was too uniform, too mathematically stable. It should have been chaotic. Mode B is a saturation cone, not precision. I know, Hale whispered. Sato continued. Our engineers eventually discovered the truth. Your cannon behaved differently because our jamming suite malfunctioned. Instead of disrupting your gun harmonics, it synchronized with them. Hale blinked. Synchronized? That's impossible. We thought so too. But the electromagnetic interference formed a resonance feedback loop. It stabilized the recoil pattern, it sharpened the spread, it turned your wrong mode into something lethal. Hale leaned back as the realization hit him like a delayed punch. So my weapon didn't, Nosato said gently. Your cannon did not shred my squadron. Our technology did. Your wrong mode only created the condition. The weight of the revelation settled between them. Hale's breath was slow, uncertain. Then why didn't anyone say this? Why wasn't this in the reports? Sato looked down at his hands, because admitting it meant admitting a chain of errors, faulty testing, unstable equipment, and of course, losing a dozen aircraft to their own interference. It would have caused disgrace, maybe worse. Hale rubbed his temples. You were the only survivor on your side. Yes, Sato said, which is why they accepted my silence. Hale's voice broke. And I lived, thinking I killed them. You survived believing a lie, Sato said, while I survived carrying it. He looked up, eyes soft. But it was a lie that kept both of us awake for many years. A knock on the door interrupted them. A young liaison placed a sealed envelope on the table and left. Sato slid it toward Hale. The archives finally authorized this. Hale opened it. Inside were photocopies of technical memos, early test reports, and a heavily redacted engineering analysis labeled Confidential, Interference Compensation Failure, WWII Sector. Hale scanned the pages. There it was. The harmonics data, the synchronization charts, and the final handwritten line from an unknown engineer. If this ever occurs in real combat, the gun will behave like an unintended air-to-air cluster effect. Hale put the pages down. His voice was barely a whisper. Everything I thought happened didn't happen the way I believed. Sato nodded. That is why I asked you here. The truth is not meant to punish. It is meant to free. They sat in silence a moment longer before Hale finally asked the question that had haunted him for 17 years. Why did you save me back then? In WWII. Sato's answer came slowly, his voice carrying the weight of old guilt. Because when you crashed into the sea, I saw a man, not an enemy. And because I had lost 12 brothers to a mistake made by men far above us, I could not let another man die for it. Hale's throat tightened. I've lived with the burden of believing I killed them, not just technically but morally, and I lived with the burden of knowing you did not. Sato looked at him deeply. A burden shared is lighter, Lieutenant. The door opened again and an elder historian signaled them. Gentlemen, the panel is ready. They request both of you. Hale stood unsure whether his legs would hold. Sato steadied him with a subtle hand on the arm, not a soldier helping a soldier, but a man helping another human being carry a truth too heavy for one alone. Marcus, Sato said softly, calling him by his first name for the first time. Today we begin to close the wound. They walked together down the corridor, not opposite sides of a war, but two survivors of the same lie. The truth was finally ready to be spoken, and both men were ready to face it, together. The reconciliation panel chamber wasn't large, but it was built with a kind of solemn geometry, polished wooden walls, frosted windows, a long white table that seemed too clean for the harshness of the stories it would hear. A translator waited at the center, though Hale and Sato rarely needed one. 3 historians, 2 military liaisons, and a technical archivist sat across from the 2 pilots. The archivist, a thin man with wire-framed glasses, spoke first. Gentlemen, today is about establishing historical clarity, not blame, not vindication, just truth. Hale and Sato exchanged a brief nod. They had both lived enough years to know that truth was rarely simple, rarely clean, and never painless. The archivist began the session with a set of still images projected onto the wall. Hale felt his heartbeat quicken when he recognized the first photograph. It was grainy monochrome, an infrared gun camera still from Hale's own aircraft captured seconds before the chaos. A dozen hostile fighters closing in, Hale's targeting cone widening. the cannon burst beginning to flare. For years, Hale had refused to look at this frame. It felt too close to a confession. "We will review only as much as is necessary," one historian said gently. "We do not wish to re-traumatize either of you." Hale appreciated the sentiment. Though the truth was that trauma didn't wait for permission, it lived inside him steady and patient. The footage rolled. Hale watched the impossible pattern again, how Mode B didn't spray chaotically, but formed a sharp, unnatural conical storm of fire. Then, the silhouettes of Sato's squadron collapsing mid-turn. The panel paused the footage. Lieutenant Hale, the historian, asked softly, "What did you believe happened in this moment?" Hale swallowed. "I believed I made a mistake, that I panicked, that I chose the wrong mode, that I killed them because I wasn't good enough." He felt his throat tighten. "And I believed I deserved to be shot down afterward." The room remained silent, not out of judgment, but reverence. Sato spoke next. "When I saw the footage for the first time, I too believed your weapon had been modified or upgraded. There were rumors, many accusations, and enormous pressure to retaliate. But the wreckage told a different story." The archivist activated a second projection. Images of twisted fuselage pieces, fragments of radar modules, and the distinctive scatter pattern of metal from Sato's fallen comrades filled the screen. "Note the consistent radial striation," the archivist said. "This pattern is impossible with Mode B under normal circumstances." The technical liaison picked up, "These are resonance lines indicating your aircraft's cannon vibration, harmonics synchronized with an external EM source." Hale listened, stunned, as every doubt he had carried began to crack. "So you're saying Mode B only worked because your jamming suite malfunctioned," he whispered. "Correct," the liaison said. "Your mode selection wasn't the cause. It was the trigger for an interference loop already building beneath you." Sato added quietly, "Your mistake was not a mistake. It was the final ingredient in a recipe our engineers wrote and forgot." Hale felt something he hadn't recognized in years, anger. Not at Sato, not at himself, but at a past built on omissions and secrecy. "How long did your side know?" he asked. Sato didn't flinch. "They knew within weeks. But by then you had been taken. And by the end of the war, so much had been destroyed. Records, equipment, people that no one wanted to resurrect, a shameful failure." Hale clenched his fists. "So the truth died because it was inconvenient." Sato met his gaze. "The truth waited. It waited for us." The panel paused for a moment before the archivist placed an object on the table. "We recovered this from Wakamori's remaining storage armory 2 months ago. It was a small metal disc, slightly corroded, stamped with symbols Hale hadn't seen since captivity." Sato inhaled sharply. "That I did not know they still had." The historian gestured gently. "Please explain its significance." Sato took the disc and set it between himself and Hale. "This is a resonance calibration chip, the foundation of our jamming suite. Its tests were incomplete. The engineers told us never to use it beyond controlled scenarios." He looked down almost ashamed. "But we deployed it anyway." The historian turned to Hale. "Were you aware this technology existed?" Hale shook his head. "No. In my reports I wrote that nothing explained the behavior. Even our analysts couldn't find a cause. Your analysts," Sato corrected softly, "couldn't find the cause because we hid it. But I knew, and keeping it secret became its own burden." Hale looked at him. "Is that why you gave me the fragment?" "Yes. It was all I could give. If I spoke openly back then, I would have been dismissed or worse. But giving you the fragment meant you might someday find someone who could understand." The archivist interjected gently. "That is why we are here. That hope has come full circle." The panel shifted to the POW side of the story. A historian addressed Sato. "Captain Sato, can you recount the events at Wakamori the night the evacuation order was given?" Sato nodded slowly. "Several officers wanted Lieutenant Hale interrogated harshly, believing he possessed knowledge of a new weapon. They were wrong, and I argued against them. I brought them the fragment to prove his innocence. When tensions escalated, firearms were drawn. I was injured, preventing Hale from being transferred to a darker fate." Hale felt the room tighten. "I never knew the details. I saw you fall. I thought it was a punishment." Sato shook his head. "It was a choice." Next, the historian addressed Hale. "Lieutenant, how did Captain Sato treat you during captivity?" Hale spoke steadily. "Better than he should have. He brought water, checked my wounds, made sure the guards didn't treat me as a trophy. He saved my life twice." The panel absorbed the testimony, the silence stretching into something profound. Reconciliation wasn't a ceremony, it was the steady accumulation of small truths that reshaped a wound. Finally, the archivist placed a slim binder in front of both men. "This contains the full technical reconstruction of the incident. It absolves both of you, and it records the fault where it belongs with an experimental system deployed without safeguards." Hale opened the binder cautiously. There was the diagram of the interference loop, the resonance escalation curve, the precise moment when his cannon harmonics synchronized with enemy frequencies. It was both terrifying and relieving, the technical proof of his innocence. The historian said quietly, "Truth alone is not reconciliation, but it is the ground upon which reconciliation can grow." Sato inclined his head. "Then let us grow something honorable from this." They signed their statements, Hale with a firm hand, Sato with a careful one. As they stood to leave, Hale felt lighter, though the weight was not gone. He turned to Sato. "When this becomes public record—" "What then?" Sato gave a faint smile. "Then the sky will contain fewer ghosts." They walked out of the chamber together, not as former enemies, but as two men who had finally placed the missing pieces of their story side by side. The sun had begun to slide behind the rooftops of the Joint Archives Annex by the time Hale and Sato stepped outside. The air carried a mild early evening chill, the kind that made people instinctively draw closer to their jackets. But Hale didn't feel cold. He felt strangely empty and full at the same time, like someone had reached into him, scooped out 17 years of questions, and replaced them with something heavier and kinder truth. They walked in silence down the stone path that curved toward the visitors' gardens. Cherry saplings swayed lightly. The wind rustled their leaves with a sound that reminded Hale of rain on tin roofs of nights in captivity when he repeated sentences in his head to keep himself sane. Not today. Not here. Not like this. But tonight the memories felt less like wounds and more like fossils, painful in shape but no longer sharp. Sato walked half a step behind him, not out of deference, but habit. Years of military instinct rarely faded. Hale slowed so they stood side by side. "I wasn't sure what today would be," Hale said softly. "I thought maybe anger, maybe blame. I didn't expect this." Sato gave a faint breath of a smile. "Nor did I. Truth is unpredictable." Hale shook his head with a quiet laugh. "You saved me when you had every reason not to." "I had every reason to," Sato replied. "War kills men fast. Lies kill them slowly. I had seen enough of both." His expression shifted slightly as though a new thought was blooming behind his calm demeanor. "I asked you to come here today not only to correct the record but because there is something I need to return." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Hale expected a document, maybe a forgotten memo, something technical. Instead, Sato withdrew a leather pouch, old, faded, and soft at the edges. He placed it gently in Hale's hands. "Open it." Hale loosened the leather tie and tipped the contents into his palm. A small dog tag slid out, a rusted fragment of aluminum stamped with his service number, name, and unit. Hale's chest tightened. "I lost this when my plane went down." Sato nodded. "I found it in the surf. I kept it safe. I told myself I would return it if we ever met again." He paused. "But I did not think we would." A lump formed in Hale's throat. "I thought this sank to the bottom of the Miyako Strait forever." "No," Sato whispered. "Some things resist sinking." Hale closed his fist around the tag, feeling its weight, its gouges, the indentations that had once rested against his skin. He remembered clasping it before missions, a small ritual. He remembered waking in the infirmary at Wakamori, confused and cold, reaching instinctively for it only to find nothing. That loss had haunted him more than he liked to admit. "Thank you," Hale finally said, voice thick. "It's more than you know." Sato shook his head gently. "It is less than you deserve, but it is what I can give." They stood there quietly for a moment. The garden lamps flickered on one by one, casting warm pools of light around them. Hale looked at Sato's face, older lines now, but the same earnestness he had recognized even inside the barbed wire of Wakamori. He wished he had said something back then, something more than the bitter sarcasm of a prisoner clinging to pride. He wished he had thanked him earlier. Sato broke the silence. There is still one last part of the truth that must be told. Hale raised his eyes. More Sato nodded and gestured for them to walk again. They followed the path to a secluded bench beneath a young cherry tree. The branches formed a kind of natural arch overhead. Sato waited until they were both seated before speaking. After you were moved from Wakamori, Sato began carefully. I was interrogated about my involvement. They suspected I had interfered with your processing. They were correct. I had. He looked down. My injury during the confrontation helped mask my actions, but the cost was a reassignment that ended my flying career. Hale inhaled sharply. They grounded you. Yes. They sent me to logistics. I never flew again. Hale felt a wave of guilt. Sato, I didn't know. I did not want you to, Sato said quietly. Knowing would only have deepened your burden. You already carried too much. The weight Hale had felt earlier pressed harder. You sacrificed your flight wings to protect a man who just destroyed your entire squadron. To protect a truth, Sato corrected gently. Not a man, a truth. Hale stared into the middle distance as twilight settled. You deserved better. Sato tilted his head slightly as if studying him. Do you know why pilots bow to the sky before each mission? Marcus Hale, surprised by the shift, shook his head. No. It is not superstition, Sato said. It is gratitude. We bow to acknowledge the sky may take us, and to thank it for letting us return. But I have come to realize something else. The sky is not an enemy. Men are. Hale breathed slowly, letting the words take root. Sato continued, voice soft as wind through paper walls. During the war, I thought of you as an adversary, then a prisoner, and eventually, a reminder. But now I think of you as something else entirely. He paused. I think of you as the only other man alive who remembers the truth of that day. Hale turned toward him. And I think of you as the man who made it possible for me to live long enough to understand it. A gentle stillness filled the space between them. Not silence, but a shared understanding made of many old shadows, finally dissolving. The door to the annex opened in the distance. The archivist stepped out, waving them over. We are ready for the final statement, he called. Hale and Sato rose slowly. Their walk back to the building felt strangely ceremonial, as if they were carrying something fragile and ancient between them. Inside the panel, weighted by a long table now set with a single document placed in the center, the archivist gestured. This is the Joint Historical Declaration. It includes the verified technical findings, the chain of command decisions that concealed the jamming malfunction, the record of Captain Sato's protective actions, and Lieutenant Hale's testimony of captivity. Both your signatures are required. Hale looked down at the pages. Every word felt heavy with consequence, not for militaries or governments, but for the ghosts of the men who had died in the strait. Sato picked up the pen first. His hand didn't tremble. He signed with calm finality, then handed the pen to Hale. Hale hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. He thought of the faces he saw in the fire of his cannon burst, the men whose last seconds were shaped by a chain of failures none of them had understood, the men whose deaths had become the anchor of his nightmares. He pressed the pen to paper and signed. A quiet exhale left the panel members. History had just been corrected. A wound had finally been stitched. The archivist bowed slightly. Thank you both. This will be preserved as part of the Reconciliation and Aviation Ethics Archive. Sato exchanged a look with Hale. A long journey, he murmured. Hale nodded. Too long, but worth it. When they stepped outside again, the night had fully settled. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and leaves. The lanterns along the path shimmered like small constellations at ground level. Sato stopped near the gate. Marcus, there is one last thing. Something I have wanted to say for many years. Hale turned, expecting solemnity. Instead, Sato bowed deeply humbly, as if offering something sacred. I am sorry for your suffering at Wakamori, he said, and I am sorry for the years you spent believing the burden was yours alone to carry." Halo felt emotion well in his chest. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Sato's shoulder. "And I am sorry for the lives lost that day, even if it wasn't my fault in the way I thought. I am sorry you carried your burden alone too." They held each other's gaze. No hostility, no guilt thrown from one side to the other. Just two men acknowledging the cost of things neither had chosen. Hale opened his hand. The dog tag Sato returned to him glinted under the lantern light. Slowly, deliberately, Hale pressed it into Sato's palm. "This should be yours now," he said quietly. "You kept it safe longer than I ever did." Sato closed his fingers around the tag, overwhelmed. "Are you certain?" Haley nodded. "Yes. It's proof we both survived." Sato bowed again, this time not out of apology, but gratitude. They walked together down the path one final time until the road forked. One path led back toward the city and the quiet home where Sato lived. The other path led toward the airfield where a transport waited to take Hale back home. They stopped at the fork. Sato said, "Marcus, I hope today made your sky clearer." Hale smiled gently. "It did. And I hope yours feels lighter." The two men, once enemies, then captor and captive, then bearers of unwanted truths, bowed to each other for the last time. Then they walked their separate ways into different futures shaped by the same past. As Hale approached the airfield, he looked up at the broad, dark sky overhead. For the first time in 17 years, he felt no locked tone, no alarm, no heaviness pressing down on him. Only openness, only depth, only the sound of a sky that no longer held enemies. A sky ready to be rewritten.